All right, good morning. Thank you for joining us for the Cottage Food Laws in California and Washington State webinar. We are pleased to have Dr. Erin DiCaprio from the University of California, Davis with us this morning, as well as Dr. Stephanie Smith from Washington State University, and Scott Rice and David Smith from the Washington State Department of Agriculture. And my name is Megan Donovan. I will be your host today. And behind the scenes, we have Larissa Hernandez providing technical assistance. She'll be the one fielding questions when they come in and may hop on as an alternative host if any technical issues arise. And we're going to get to the webinar presentation shortly, but first I'm going to go through a few quick housekeeping items. And just to note, we'll be turning our videos off during the presentation, but we'll be back on during the question and answer sessions. We just want to let you know there are faces behind the voices, but we will be back in a little bit. So as I mentioned, my name is Megan Donovan, and both Larissa and I work for the CCOF Foundation, which is pleased to collaborate with our partners to host today's webinar. Guided by the wisdom of our farming roots, the CCOF Foundation unites the organic community to advance organic agriculture. We offer intentional education, financial support, and growth opportunities for organic professionals. We wanted to acknowledge that today's webinar is supported through a food safety outreach program grant from the USDA National Institute of Food and Agriculture. Please note the contents of the webinar do not necessarily represent the official views of the USDA. And also note this webinar is not providing legal advice. This is the final webinar in our 9-part Food Safety for Organic Processors series. If you missed any of the previous webinars, visit the CCOF website for links to the recordings. If you're having difficulties connecting to the webinar, if you can't hear or can't see, please call our office for support at 831-423-2263. Press 0 for the operator and someone will help you connect to the webinar. And finally, we're going to do a very speedy Zoom tutorial. To see the Zoom webinar controls, move your mouse over the image of the shared screen. If you're in full screen viewing mode and would prefer to view the webinar in a window, click on the View Options tab at the top of the shared screen and select Exit Full Screen Mode to exit the full screen. Throughout the webinar, we will stop from time to time for questions and answers. To send in questions or communicate with our webinar staff, click on the question and answer icon at the bottom of the shared screen. The question and answer box will pop open. Write your questions into the field at the bottom of the box and click send. If you would like to send your question anonymously, check the send anonymously box on the left. Note, we will not be using the chat function during this webinar, so send in all messages or questions through the question and answer box. And feel free to send in questions at any time. We'll collect those and then address them during the question and answer breaks. At the end of the webinar, an invitation to take our webinar evaluation survey will pop up. To take the survey, click on the link and answer a few quick questions to help us improve our offerings. As a final reminder, today's webinar is being recorded and will be posted on the CCOF YouTube channel. We will send a link to the recording along with a PDF of the slides to all webinar registrants. And just to let you know, we have a lot of folks online today. I think we had over 150 people sign up. So there's a lot of interest in cottage foods. So we're going to try to get to as many questions and comments as we can, but we apologize in advance if we don't get to your specific question and encourage you to follow up after the webinar to answer any additional questions. So with that, I would like to introduce our lead trainer. Dr. Erin DiCaprio is an assistant specialist in cooperative extension in the Department of Food Science and Technology at the University of California, Davis. Her area of expertise is in microbial food safety with an emphasis on foodborne viruses. And again, I'd like to welcome our supporting team. Today we have Scott Rice and David Smith from the Washington State Department of Agriculture and Dr. Stephanie Smith from Washington State University. So Erin, with that, I will hand things over to you.
Great. Thanks, Megan. Good morning, everyone. Really excited to be here today to talk through cottage food laws. Of course, we're emphasizing the laws in California and Washington, but the majority of states in the United States do have their own cottage food law, and I think it's a really great opportunity for individuals interested in entering the food industry to kind of get a sense of how their product does on the market without sort of the financial commitment of going the larger food processing facility route. So what we'll cover today, we'll start out with just kind of a review of general food safety concepts and which types of food, because of their inherent properties, are considered low-risk processed foods. So these are the types of processed foods that are generally allowable under various cottage food laws. We'll then go through an overview of the cottage food law in California, followed by the cottage food law in Washington. And overall, I think there are some general basic requirements of all of these cottage food laws that cross state lines. So we'll highlight some of those items because they're relevant to both California and Washington. So I wanted to just start today talking through the different types of hazards that can potentially occur in food and lead to foodborne illness. The first are physical hazards. These are items like glass, metal, or bones that can inadvertently end up in a food product and cause damage to an individual's mouth or digestive tract if they're ingested. The second type of hazard we're concerned about in foods are the chemical hazards. These include allergens, mycotoxins produced by mold growth, any chemical used for processing or sanitizing, among others. So here in the US, the big 8 allergens that we're required to control for in the food industry are dairy, eggs, peanuts, tree nuts, fish, crustaceans, wheat, and soy. So these are also very important for cottage food operators to pay attention to, because there are requirements for allergen labeling of cottage foods, as well as control for allergen cross-contact during production of your cottage foods. And then the last group of hazards are the biological hazards. So this group includes microorganisms, pathogenic microorganisms that are transmitted by food. So that includes some types of bacteria, viruses, and parasites that can cause illness in humans if they're ingested. So our food safety regulations really focus on all of all three types of these hazards, but there's a lot of emphasis on the biological hazards in particular, because they do lead to a number of foodborne outbreaks. So maintaining the safety and also the quality of food is an interplay of intrinsic factors that are associated with the food itself, the type of processing that's going to be used for that particular food item, and then also intrinsic factors such as the type of food packaging we're using, or how that food item is going to be stored after processing. And so I wanted to kind of highlight 2 intrinsic factors that are very, very important to consider when we're talking about low risk types of food. So the first intrinsic factor I want to highlight is pH. So pH is essentially the acidity level of a product, and it really is a critical factor to consider when it comes to the safety of that particular food item. The other intrinsic factor I just want to mention here is water activity. This is the amount of available water in a food product that microorganisms can utilize for their own growth and metabolism. And this is really another critical factor to consider when it comes to the safety of food. I know for some, this may be your first introduction to some of these concepts. So if you're looking for a little bit more in-depth information related to pH, water activity, other factors that contribute to the microbial safety of foods, you can check out my YouTube channel. I have some really short kind of informational videos on all of those different concepts. So you may or may not be aware of these two organizations. I think folks are, but here in the US, we have two major federal regulatory agencies that hold the majority of responsibility in regards to food safety. So the United States Department of Agriculture, USDA's Food Safety Inspection Service. So they have authority over meats, poultry, and amenable species, and also the Food and Drug Administration, which basically covers all other types of food with the exception of meats, poultry, and those amenable species. These are the two organizations that enforce food safety regulations here in the United States. So that's at the national level. So beyond these federal regulations, there are also state and local food safety regulations that apply to food processors. So in California, the local county departments of environmental health oversee cottage food operations. They also oversee food safety in restaurants, farmers markets, and retail food establishments, so grocery stores. At the state level, the Department of Public Health Food and Drug Branch oversees processed food registrations, organic processed food registrations. So those would be required for any food manufacturer that's not making a low acid canned food or an acidified canned food. For those processors that are making those two categories of products, they're required to have a cannery license in California, and that program is also overseen by our state public health department. And in California, as well as many other states, as well as Washington, the state department also does the enforcement of the federal regulations. So here in California, our state inspectors are going in and doing the inspections to make sure folks are in compliance with the federal regulations, the FDA regulations in most cases. So in Washington, local county departments of health oversee restaurants, temporary permits, retail food establishments. The State Department of Agriculture oversees cottage food operations in Washington. So that's one difference between California and Washington. So California, that's cottage foods, that's at the local county level, but in Washington, that's at the state level where those cottage food operations are registered. The WSDA also issues the food processors licenses and the organic certifications in Washington. Similar to California, WSDA also enforces those federal regulations. So they're going to be the ones coming into food processing facilities and doing inspections related to, for example, Food Safety Modernization Act, preventive controls for human food rule. So, before we get into the nitty gritty on the different cottage food laws in each state, I wanted to introduce here the general concept of this hierarchy of food safety risks associated with different food types. So the foods considered lowest risk are those that have a low water activity, so below 0.85, and or a low pH. So generally with pH, food with a pH at or below 4.6 is considered a low pH or high acid food product. And any combination of that low pH and low water activity also enhances the food safety of that product. So that high acid level, low pH or low water activity content in these foods makes it unlikely that foodborne pathogens can grow in these products. That doesn't mean they're free of risk, but because pathogens cannot grow in these products, they typically can be produced with the lowest level of regulatory oversight. So our cottage foods in general are going to fall into this low risk category where they're either low water activity foods, low pH foods, or foods that have a combination of low water activity and low pH. I will say as well, depending on how much product you produce, and we'll get into the sales thresholds for cottage food, but generally the more food you produce, even if it's one of these lower risk foods, you are going to have more regulatory oversight. The highest risk foods kind of on this spectrum are those that pose a very serious health risk if they're not properly, if they're not strictly controlled for safety during production. So many of these food types can potentially cause botulism if improperly processed. So I'm talking here primarily about low acid canned foods, acidified canned foods. And because these types of foods have this significant health risk associated with them not being produced properly, they're going to have the most regulatory oversight. That typically is also going to correlate to a higher cost associated with production. So it's, really important to kind of understand this concept of low risk versus high risk and be thinking about a product you have in mind and where that product might fall on this spectrum. So I already mentioned this, but, there are products that are, quote unquote, easier in terms of regulatory oversight. And those are, typically going to be the low risk foods. Again, those low water activity foods with a water activity at 0.85 or below, low acid or high acid foods, with a pH at 4.6 or below, or these products that have a combination of a high acid level and low water activity. And some examples of those types of products are shown here. So a low water activity food, for example, would be a baked good where we're, driving out water during that baking process, resulting in a food product that has a very low level of free water for microorganisms to go. Things like dried herbs, where we're driving out the water from those products are considered low water activity. Things like candy, things that have a lot of sugar or salt are generally going to be low water activity foods because the sugar or the salt can actually bind water in the food matrix, making it unavailable for microorganisms to grow. In terms of foods that are naturally high acid, something like vinegar, extremely acidic, there aren't going to be pathogenic microorganisms capable of growing, likely not even surviving in that vinegar product. And then an example of a food that has a combination of low water activity and naturally high acidity would be a fruit-based jam or jelly. So the fruit is going to be high in acid. We're adding a significant amount of sugar to these products, lowering the water activity. So this is kind of a classical example of low water activity and high acidity. And generally, these are going to be the foods that show up on the approved cottage food list. So I just wanted to give an example here to highlight the difference between a low and higher risk food type. So many fruit-based jellies and jams are considered low risk due to the high acid level in that starting fruit product and the addition of sugar in these recipes. So just in this example, I'm making an apple jelly. Apples are considered an acidic food, and we're also adding a significant amount of sugar to this jelly. So that the final pH of our apple jelly is around 3.5, so well below that 4.6 threshold. And the water activity here would be around 0.65. So again, well below that 0.85 threshold we're concerned about with water activity. So this particular product is going to be high acid, meaning low pH, and also have a very low water activity. So in contrast to that, something like a pumpkin butter. So pumpkin is a low acid vegetable, so it has a pH above 4.6. In this particular recipe, there's also less sugar added compared to our jelly ratio, to our jelly recipe. So the ratio of pumpkin to sugar is relatively low here. And so in this particular recipe, this would be considered a higher risk product. So we have a pH above 4.6, a water activity around 0.85. So this is not something that you can make in a cottage food operation. You'd likely need a cannery license for this particular product because you're either going to utilize some sort of formulation alteration where you're, acidifying this product, or you're going to have to process this under retort or high pressure conditions to make it a safe shelf-stable item. So in order to produce a safe product and understand which types of regulations apply to your particular product, there's several parameters that you need to know, and these include the pH, the water activity of your particular product, specific details of the formulation, so specifics on your ingredients. Are you using any added preservatives? You also want to know the weights of all the ingredients in your formulation. You also need to be thinking about how you're processing that particular item. Are you doing some type of water bath canning, for example? How is that product going to be packaged and stored long term? So all of those things factor in to the overall safety of the food and which regulations ultimately are going to apply to production of that food item. So I'll just pause here if there's any questions. If not, we can jump right in to the cottage food regulation.
Thanks, Erin. We did have a couple of questions come in. Someone was wondering if freeze-dried fruits and vegetables are considered low risk?
That's a good question, and maybe we'll just hold that. I think there's differing opinions on that between California and Washington, and you'll see why I say that in just a minute.
All right. And then we also had a question asking if fresh spirulina with water removed, packed in glass jars and stored in cold, if this would be allowed for cottage food permitting or PFR permitting in California for sales at farmers markets.
Yeah, I talked to one of our state inspectors that has gone into some spirulina facilities. So that would not fall under cottage foods in California, and likely not in any other state as well, with the exception of maybe one that I'll highlight. But that would be something that would need to be produced in a facility that has a processed food registration. So if you're refrigerating it, then the PFR would apply, but you need to make sure that you're maintaining that refrigeration, from production through distribution and at retail. So, yeah.
Great, thanks. And we had one more question coming in about dried mushrooms, but I think like the dried fruits and vegetables, that will come up in the next section.
Yep.
So I think we can move on.
Okay.
But yeah, folks, feel free to keep in writing in your questions, and we'll get them at our final question and answer break.
Okay. I had to peek and make sure I was off mute. Okay, so let's get into the cottage food law. So cottage food laws are state regulations, so not federal. This is at the state level, that allow for processing of certain low-risk foods in home kitchens for sale to the general public. So these laws, these cottage food laws, they are unique to each state. So these are established state by state. And so the types of food allowed for production, the sales channels, the licensing requirements, the maximum annual sales thresholds can really vary widely from state to state. So whatever state you reside in, you want to look to that state's cottage food law. And because these are state and not, this isn't a federal law, these are state laws, the foods produced in a cottage food operation cannot be sold across state lines. So if you're a cottage food operator in California, you can only sell that product in California. You can't sell it to neighboring states. If you're doing online orders, you cannot sell those cottage foods across state lines. So I just want to make sure that everyone understands that as soon as a food product crosses state lines, that's FDA's jurisdiction. So cottage food, state law, only sold selling those products within the state in which that operation is licensed. And so one website that we refer some people that reach out to us in California that are not Californians but are interested in cottage food is this Forager website. And it allows you to do a quick search of what states have cottage food laws and what types of foods are allowed. So this could be, a really quick resource to look at to see if your state has a cottage food law. Generally the types of foods that are produced, but you would also want to verify that with, your state Department of Agriculture or Public Health, just to make sure the information here is accurate. But I really like this map because it shows, basically every state in the US has a cottage food law. They rate them here as which ones are okay, great, poor, but you at least here get a sense that these laws are pretty prevalent in the US. Rhode Island is the only state that does not have a version of the cottage food law. And Wyoming has a food freedom law where you can produce any kind of food product in your home kitchen and sell it to consumers, which as a food safety specialist, you know, it does concern me a bit because, as I said, some of these foods, if improperly processed, can, you know, lead to botulism. And so, you know, I think it's great that there is some flexibility in smaller scale in-home production of these low-risk foods, but I you know, I take pause when I, you know, think about production of some of these higher risk foods at a, you know, smaller scale with less regulatory oversight. So again, just reiterating here that you want to make sure that you look at your particular state's cottage food law and not a neighboring state, because there are certainly differences in how each state views what types of products can be produced under these different laws. So if you've tuned into any of our previous webinars, and if you're a grower, you know, there isn't much you can do in terms of food processing on your farm. But luckily, we do have these cottage food laws that will allow for some smaller scale production, you know, in a residential kitchen without some of the kind of more cumbersome regulatory food regulations that can apply to food processors. So we'll start here talking through the California cottage food law. So for these operations, these operations have to be a kitchen in your house. So this can't be a kitchen that's outside of your primary residence. So if you had, you know, a garage, detached garage with a kitchen, that's not your cottage food operation. It has to be the kitchen within your primary residence. So our California Department of Public Health Food and Drug Branch, they have a lot of information on cottage foods. So you can find the complete list of allowable cottage foods there. Some other really important resources there that I'll walk you through in a minute. But on that website, you will see that there are two types of cottage food permits that are issued in California. The Class A cottage food permit is for direct to consumer sales. So you're selling directly to consumers out of your house or mailing to them or at a farmer's market. So for Class A operations, they just upped actually. I think within the last year, the maximum gross annual sales limit is now $75,000 for Class A cottage food operations. Class B operations, they can sell their product directly to consumers, just like you can with Class A, but Class B operators can also sell their products through restaurants or retail food establishments. So they could sell through a local grocery store or restaurant. And the maximum allowable annual sales for a Class B operation is $150,000 now. You can probably guess that it's more expensive to start a Class B operation compared to a Class A. So the Class B application fee is going to be higher than Class A. But generally for both Class A and Class B, it's required that the cottage food operator attend a food handler certificate course. They have to register with their environmental health department. So there's a number of forms and filings and fees that apply. And for a Class A operation, you likely won't have an inspection of your home kitchen, but that may vary from county to county. But Class B, more likely that your home kitchen is going to be inspected and a higher frequency by the county environmental health department compared to Class A. But there is county to county variation here in California, and I'll touch on that throughout the talk here as well. So again, we have these two different types of cottage food licenses, the Class A and the Class B. So for both types, orders can occur basically by any method. So you can take those orders by phone, internet, other methods, and you can deliver the foods in person, by mail, or using a third-party delivery service. You don't physically have to hand these products off to consumers. But I just want to highlight again that this is a state law. And so if you are mailing or using some third-party delivery service, make sure that those deliveries are within the state of California and not across state lines. So here are the categories of approved cottage foods for production in California. So we do have, baked goods, candies, nuts, nut mixes, the fruit jams, jellies, which I think are pretty common for most cottage food laws. We have vinegars, mustards. We do allow dried, dehydrated, and freeze-dried foods under our California cottage food law. So you would want to go to that list and see kind of what you're thinking about. Freeze drying is on the list. Basically, fruits, vegetables, herbs are normally things that fly. You're not going to be able to do any kind of meats or jerkies under the cottage food law. But that is something we can do here in California that is not allowed in Washington, for example, or some other states. But it's really important, the CDPH's website has these general categories and some examples, but I would highly recommend checking in with your local environmental health department just to verify that what you're planning to do, fits within the scope of the regulation. So they'll talk to you even before you put in your registration forms, just to try and steer you in the right direction. You'll also see here that the fruit butters, jams, and jellies, they have to comply with Part 150 of Title 21 of the Code of Federal Regulations. So this is the standard of identity for jams, jellies, fruit preserves, and the majority of the cottage food laws that I've looked at, this is a requirement for the fruit, butters, jams, and jellies. So we'll talk a little bit more about what is in that regulation as well. So although this is a state law in California, the State Department of Public Health Food and Drug Branch does not issue the permits for cottage food operations. This is done at the county level in California. So as I already mentioned, the Department of Health website does have a number of really nice resources, including the list of approved food, links to the law itself. But they also have this document that lists all the local environmental health departments. So I would definitely seek this out early on so you can connect with your local environmental health departments. So if you open the doc, you can look for your county of residence and you'll find the contact information for that county's department, environmental health department. In some cases, that county may actually have a website dedicated to cottage food. So really useful document to reference. So each county is going to have a slightly different process, but generally there's an application. You're going to have to complete this food handler safety certificate, send in example labels, and pay a fee for the county where you're going to establish your business. As I mentioned, the Class B is generally going to be more expensive than your Class A registration fees. Those fees are also going to vary from county to county. So I've seen some counties where it's a couple $100 and some where it's almost $1,000. Something else to think about is that you might have additional county permits that are required if you're selling somewhere that's not from your home. So if you're selling at a farmer's market or a farm stand, you're also going to want to check with your county about the requirements for selling at those venues. So you might have additional registrations and fees to pay. So just a couple of weeks ago, I got drawn into a discussion where a grower was selling strawberries at a farm stand, but wanted to then sell jam, strawberry jam produced under their cottage food license at that same farm stand, and also sell strawberries from another grower. And kind of that mix of different items required a higher level, essentially, of farm stand registration. So definitely, check in with your county on issues related to that as well. So I wish I could say that, each county approached cottage food operations and sales the same here in California, but anecdotally, I know that isn't the case. So definitely check in at the county level if you're making these food products. So now let's transition to the cottage food law in Washington. So again, this is production of these low-risk foods in a home kitchen. In Washington, the sales limit is $25,000 per year, so less than here in California. Sorry, my allergies, I think, are getting the best of me today. So the complete list of foods that you're allowed to produce can be found on the Washington State Department of Ag's website, but here are some examples listed here. In Washington, you're going to register with USDA, so at the state level, not the county level. And so that application is going to be the same for anyone in Washington, regardless of the county in which you reside. So under this particular law, these foods can only be sold direct to consumers. So you can't sell through restaurants or retail markets. It was also, well, within the law, it's also required that you deliver these products directly to consumers as well. So there's no third-party delivery service, mail option under the law in Washington. However, due to COVID-19, there is a temporary allowance for mailing these products to end consumers. But again, that is not part of the law and likely will go away as we see these restrictions due to COVID lift. So in terms of sales channels, Washington, it is a bit different from California. So you can order and process that payment on, but the delivery must be in person. And again, that's what's in the law in Washington. So you can do that in-person delivery from your home, from your farm, at a farmer's market, at other local events. But just know if you're going the farmer's market local event route, you do want to check in this case at the county level to see what kind of permitting is required there. Under the law, though, mailing or using that third-party delivery service cannot happen in Washington. But for right now, it seems that mailing is at least an option. And if anybody has questions about the longevity of that, maybe you can draw David in on that discussion in a little bit. So here are the general categories of foods allowed for production in Washington under the cottage food law. So there's definitely some differences between California and Washington. So in Washington, no dried, dehydrated fruits, vegetables, or herbs are allowed, but we can do that in California under the cottage food law. Much like California, you can make fruit butters, jams, and jellies, but those have to be compliant with 21 CFR Part 150. You do have the option to do small batch roasted coffee beans. That may be a very specific to Washington cottage food item. I don't see that in many other states. But again, you can find all of this information on USDA's website. They have a wonderful website with great resources for cottage food operators. So seek that out. But I thought we could take a minute just kind of walking through the cottage food permit application for Washington State, because you would all be using the exact same form and be submitting the same documents, not the same here in California. So on the face page of the application, this is kind of your, basic information, name, address. You would enter the information on your food worker card here. Signing that you have give consent to USDA to come in and do an inspection of your home. And then there's a number of attachments that you also need to submit. So one that probably folks have some questions about is related to water supply. So you do, have to identify what type of water you're using. And if you're using municipal water, you can include a recent water bill showing the address of the cottage food operation. And this is just essentially verifying that you're using municipal water, which of course is treated to be potable water. But if you're using well water, in contrast, you need to have your water tested. So you would need to do this 60 days prior to the permitting of your cottage food establishment, and then annually every year after that. And so you would be keeping this documentation that the water is potable and providing that to WSDA as requested. You also submit to them with your application, your food worker card, your business license. You need to attach a schematic of your CFO's floor plan, CFO cottage food operations floor plan, showing, how your kitchen's set up, where you're storing things, where the bathrooms are located, where your hand washing sinks are located. But again, all of this information is on the WSDA's website, and you can see these little call out boxes that show exactly what should be included in these attachments, and in many cases have examples of these attachments for you to work from. You, of course, provide example labels for your product. This is also something that we have to do in California. And we'll talk about those labeling requirements in a minute. You also describe the type of packaging you're using for your product in an attachment. And another attachment, how you're cleaning and sanitizing your equipment, utensils, and food contact surfaces. You have to submit a list of all the equipment and utensils you'll be using. You need to submit a sales plan, so how you're going to be selling these products, as well as some processing dates, so when you're actually making these food items. And then finally, you have to have a pet and also a child management plan if that applies to your particular situation. So this application package that you download from WSDA's website, it's very descriptive. It has these examples to work from. So I think if you're new to this game, the application package itself could be very, very informative on what you need to submit and how they would like that to look when you submit it to them. So if you are planning on making jelly jam or preserves or any related products, you do need to make sure that they comply with this federal regulation. So 21 CFR Part 150 is the FDA's standard of identity for these types of products. So fruit-based jellies, jams, and preserves. So this regulation lists specific types of fruits that are allowed to be used in these products, specific fruit to sugar ratios for particular types of fruits, as well as some other key parameters. And you must comply with this particular regulation if you are a cottage food operator. And so I in the resource list you'll receive, there are some guidance documents on this particular regulation, but I think David probably has a lot of insight, and I'm sure folks on the call today have questions, so we can try and address those in the Q&A as well at the end of today. But there are some general requirements kind of across the board for cottage food facilities, whether they're in California, Washington, or somewhere else. And part of that is that you produce in a primary residential kitchen. So this is not an outbuilding somewhere on your property that happens to have a kitchen. There needs to be hand washing sinks available within that space, and those need to be designated for the cottage food operation. So oftentimes in your application, you're going to call out what sink is your hand washing sink. You're not allowed to have carpet in the kitchen and any food contact surface. So things like your countertops need to be smooth and easy to clean and sanitize. You also need to have a management plan to restrict access of pets or young children to that kitchen during production. So if I'm, baking my cookies for my cottage food operation, I can't have my 2 dogs in the kitchen at the same time. So that management plan could include, I'm keeping them outdoors during that time, or I'm, gating off the kitchen so they can't access. There are also basic requirements for cleaning and sanitation. So generally you need to provide a list of the equipment that you're going to be using and how all of that equipment will be cleaned and sanitized. Food contact surfaces, so again, things like your counter top, how you're going to be cleaning and sanitizing those surfaces. If you're using any allergenic ingredients, you need to have a description on how those are going to be managed to minimize allergen cross contact. Hand washing, really, it's called out in all the cottage food laws. It's required, but it's also critically important to maintaining safety. So frequent hand washing a requirement under the regulation. And for the organic side of things, I think we always talk about chemistry. So if you're concerned or have questions whether a particular chemistry you're using for cleaning or sanitizing is appropriate for an organic operation, you can check in with your certifier to see if it's certified for organic use. So this is a question that comes to me a lot here in California, and it's around approved sources of ingredients for cottage food operators. And generally, where you can buy ingredients, that's going to be retail food markets, so places like grocery stores, farms that are registered with state departments of ag. So you could, buy directly from the farm or farm stand if they're registered with the state, or from a grower that is selling at farmers markets. You can also purchase from food processing facilities that are registered with the state. So if you have a more formulated ingredient you're using, you can go directly to the processor if they're registered. In California, within the law, it's required that these be approved sources, but generally, what are not considered approved sources are home gardens, community gardens, or any kind of foraging. So you can't go out and pick strawberries from the garden in your backyard and use those to make jam under the law. However, I do think there are some differences county to county and how that is viewed. How these approved sources are kind of certified from county to county can have some major differences. So, if you're interested in exploring some of these, alternative sources, I would definitely check in with your county to see their view on the source you're potentially going to be working with. In Washington, you are allowed to use fresh picked fruits from non-commercial sources, so a home garden, for example, but only when a kill step is included in the process of making your cottage food item. So an example here would be making and canning strawberry jam. So you're heating up those strawberries to make the jam, and then you're going to be following a water bath canning process to can as well. So that would be your kill step. But if you're making a product that wouldn't have a kill step, which is generally going to be some kind of heating or thermal process, then you can't use fresh picked fruits from non-commercial sources in Washington. But definitely want to emphasize for those in California, check in with your county if you're thinking about sources of ingredients that aren't from a grocery store, aren't from a registered farm or processing facility here in California. So in terms of labeling, there is very specific information that needs to be on a cottage food label. First is, and this is both in California and Washington, is the statement made in a home kitchen, the address of the home, and the business or person's name. In California, we also require you to include your cottage food license number and the county in which it was issued. Both for Washington and California, you would have your ingredient list. You would have a separate list of any allergens that appear in your product, and then a net weight for the particular item you're generating. So both on the CDPH website for California cottage food operators and the USDA website for Washington cottage food operators. There are examples of these labels for you to reference. So this is our example label for California. So you see the language made in the home kitchen, followed by the permit number, the county in which that permit was issued, address, the ingredient list here. There are allergens present, so contains wheat, eggs, milk, soy, walnuts, a lot of allergens in this cookie, and then the net weight. For Washington, it looks really similar. So again, made in the home kitchen, the address here, ingredient list here. The allergens don't seem to have a specific call out, but if you are working baked goods, typically have a lot of these allergens. You at a minimum want to make sure and double, triple check that those allergens are in your ingredient list, because for those folks with allergens, that's a really significant health effect, health impact if those allergens are present. And then of course, the net weight of the particular item. So we'll just touch on here, and we can get into the weeds a little bit more with Scott at the end if people have more questions. But just to touch on organic considerations when it comes to labeling cottage foods. But basically, if you have a non-certified organic processed food product, the only place that word organic can show up is in the ingredient list. So nowhere else on the label or package. And so on this slide here, there are just two examples of how that label could look if you are using organic ingredients in your cottage food product. So you can call it out in the ingredient list, but it can't show up anywhere else on that food package. Then this other question, can I get an organic certification for my cottage food business? The short answer is yes, it is possible, but it is important to consider if it makes sense for your business. So there are loads of complicated process considerations and paperwork required for organic certification. It may limit what ingredients you can use. So if a supplier runs out of a specific organic ingredient you're using, you can't just sub it out for a non-organic version. I would imagine it can be very complicated to try and get organic certification in a home kitchen. Much easier in a more controlled, I think, environment like a commercial kitchen space. That could be something easier to obtain the organic certification for, but then in that scenario, you wouldn't be a cottage food operator anyways, because you're not in your home kitchen. I think one of the kind of workarounds is that as a cottage food operator, you are selling directly to consumers, so you're able to communicate, about your product and how it was processed and the ingredients you use. So overall, the organic label in that case may be less relevant, but just something to think about. And then, if you are an organic farm that's selling non-organic value-added products, we say it a lot, but check in with your organic certifier to ensure you understand labeling requirements and restrictions. You definitely would want to let the certifier know that you are selling some non-organic products. Clearly in your market displays, label, designate organic from non-organic products, and prevent the commingling of organic and non-organic products as well. So organic labeling for me is challenging. I think for probably many of you that are living in that space, it's a little more straightforward. But we wanted to provide some guidance just around organic labeling as well as organic handling for those that maybe are less familiar, just so you can kind of walk through what's required, what's allowed, and get a better handle on that. We also have a number of resources that we hope will be useful for folks interested in starting a cottage food business. So on the national level, if you are not from California or Washington, but a neighboring state and interested in cottage foods, I would definitely recommend going to that Forager website that I showed the national map from. They have a lot of great information on, state to state variations, but also generally for anyone entering the cottage food industry, some resources that might be useful to you. And then of course the 21 CFR Part 150, if you want to have a look at that regulation, if you're thinking about jams, jellies, preserves, you need to look at that regulation. That's at the national level as well. California, there is a lot of great information, again, from the state's Department of Public Health, Food and Drug Branch. We also, UC Davis and University of California Cooperative Extension have some information on cottage foods. A number of years ago, a group in Cooperative Extension put together a cottage food handbook and website for folks here in California. So a link to that is here. And then for those in Washington State, I already mentioned it, but WSDA's cottage food page is really great. There's a lot of in-depth information on the page. If you download the registration packet, there's also a lot of good information in that package. And then I'm sure there are many other great resources out there, but I think going to WSDA and CDPH's website as a starting point will help you get a better understanding of what's required and what types of foods you're able to produce. So with that, I think we can open it up for questions, and I'm sure we have many of them.
Great, thank you, Erin. That was a nice overview of the regulations both in California and Washington. And I think to start with, we had a number of questions come in about whether certain ingredients are allowed, or if, what product they were thinking of doing was allowed for the cottage food. So just kind of to reiterate, in California, it sounds like that, taking a look at the CDPH website for cottage foods, and then checking in with your county Department of Environmental Health just to run those by them before getting into full production would be the way to go. And then in Washington State, David, do you want to talk a little bit about just what that process would look like if folks can, check in with your food safety department to make sure that what they're doing is following the regulation?
Yeah, absolutely. The best way to reach us is our food safety email address, and we'll share that here in a minute. But we're always happy to answer questions about specific products. I see one being asked about cottage cream cheese. And so we say all frostings and glazes have to have a cook step or made with ingredients that include a large amount of sugar that when combined are stable at room temperature. So it's refrigeration for us is a limiting factor for cottage food. But yeah, we're absolutely just happy to have conversations.
Great, thank you. And then Scott, I know Erin touched a little bit on just sort of organic considerations for smaller businesses. Do you have anything you want to add to that?
I think she touched on the major points there, and as David said, we're always happy to talk about the regulation and provide some technical assistance. And I would say in our experience, folks that are just starting out with a business, there's a lot to track as it is. And adding organic right out of the gates is kind of another pretty big chunk to bite off. So I think if you are just getting started, we often find that getting your legs under you and your business rolling is really the best first step to get you prepared for what the organic considerations are, which really it gets down to additional record keeping. And even if you are an exempt operation, you are still required to maintain those records. And those include your production, your sourcing, valid organic certificates for the things that you are working with. So again, just a fair amount of things to dive into when you're just starting out with your business. And we encourage you to make sure it's the right step for you before diving in on that. But always welcome any questions and calls.
Great, thank you. Yeah, and I know at CCOF, we also have an applicant support team that's happy to help folks when they have questions and see if it's a good fit for them too. So moving on to some other questions. One person was wondering in Washington state if they could use a PO box instead of the physical home address on their cottage food label.
You know, the only path we have for that is sometimes if someone's a victim of domestic abuse, there's a path for that. But otherwise, unless there's a court ordered kind of process or allowance, then we would say no.
Great, thank you. And then someone else was wondering, they have a farm and their garden is a part of their farm with an FSA farm number. And they're wondering, in that case, could they source their fruit or products for their cottage foods from that garden that's incorporated as part of the farm?
I think, oh, sorry. Go ahead, David.
Well, for us, it was easy. Already was mentioned that we allow home-based, so that's easy.
I think that would also fly in California, but I would still just check in with your county. I think there are counties that are a little bit, there's a little more flexibility in certain counties compared to others. So depending where you are, it can really vary the response, but it sounds like that to me would be allowable.
Great, thank you. And then going back, I think maybe to county variations in California, someone wrote in saying that in Shasta County, they were told that they needed quarterly water testing for a Class A cottage food permit, and that the person who takes the sample cannot be the business owner of the cottage food business, that they would need to pay for that. So I don't know, Aaron, if you have any more insight sort of on water testing requirements in California and what those are.
Yeah, so that's interesting. That seems like a frequent testing regime. So there is, kind of similar to Washington, right? If you are using municipal water, you just would show proof of that. And if you are using well water, there is a requirement that you do testing to ensure that water is potable. I think annual testing is reasonable, but it sounds like quarterly testing is what they're requiring in Shasta. So it should explicitly kind of point to that in the registration for the counties. But if you're not using municipal water, there certainly will be an expectation that you do some testing of your wells to make sure they meet those potable water standards.
Great, thanks. And so we've been talking mostly here about, direct to consumer sales and food, where it's not like you're sitting down and having a dinner. And one of the questions asked in, if you're doing kind of more of a food service where it's a dinner or a lunch, do the cottage foods laws cover that?
A different one does in California now. AB 626, I think it is. It passed, maybe it was before the pandemic. So it is I think it's called micro enterprise home kitchens. So I didn't look at it before today. So I'm not going to try and speak to the specific details, but I think it actually kind of modeled our cottage food law. So the things like facilities, sanitation and cleaning, utensils, all of that is very similar. I believe the annual sales threshold is around $50,000 a year. But because, prepared food is different than processed food, there are also other requirements that are more similar to a restaurant setting, like establishing specific cooking temperatures for a particular product, monitoring temperatures during storage, making sure that you're not, keeping something in that danger zone temperature range longer than it should be. And so to my knowledge, it's so that particular state law has to be accepted, I guess, county by county. And so not every county in California allows for those micro enterprise kitchens. But I think there are a number that allow for them. So there is an option for that, but feel free to shoot me an email and I can send you some more specifics about that.
Great, thanks, Erin. And David, in Washington State, what does the scene look like for sort of the home restaurant is basically what we're talking about.
Right, the home restaurant, micro enterprise is a term we're familiar with as well. Currently, it is not allowed in Washington State, those types of operations. And so it's something similar to this, offering prepared foods that are hot hold and cold hold would be more of a retail operation, a restaurant. So that would be licensed by our county health jurisdictions.
Great, thank you. And I noticed we have a number of questions just sort of talking about vinegar and pickling vegetables. So I just wanted to touch in again on where that would fall in the cottage food laws.
That would be considered pickled, peppers and vinegar.
Mm-hmm. It's a no. It's a no for us.
No for us.
Okay. No pickled carrots. You have to get your canning license in California then, or?
Yeah, no fermenting under cottage food laws. So fermenting in California, you need a processed food registration. But if you're acidifying using vinegar to pickle, then you have to go another level up to a cannery license.
Yeah, it would require a food processor license for us. So.
Okay. Yeah, it seems a lot of like the salsas and the hot sauces and the things that folks really, are excited about don't quite fall into this law. So good to know. And another question that came in, just kind of noticed that California's regulations are much less restrictive than Washington State's, and they're wondering if there's an effort for like a national cottage food permit regulation.
I'm not aware of a national effort. You know, the FDA regulates interstate commerce of food, and so it becomes a state by state decision on some of these products in this scope.
Yeah, I've never, haven't heard anything about that. I have a colleague in Rhode Island, and she said we're never going to have cottage foods, and they're the only state that doesn't. But yeah, I think it would just, because there are states like Wyoming where you could make vinegar based pickles and things at home. I want to say Oregon, you can do a little bit more than we can do here in California. So yeah, I would imagine if there were to be something nationally, it would be a very restrictive list. And so somewhere like Wyoming, I don't think it would work.
Yeah, well, and also if you're not selling between
Right.
state lines too, that might be a kind of federal regulation for a local thing. So I think we just had one more sort of ingredient question that we'll hit on, and then we'll wrap things up. And someone was just wondering where like making corn tortillas out of masa would fall in the cottage food laws. So David, you want to go first, and then Aaron?
Sure. Yeah, we can say yes to this one for Washington State.
Yeah, same.
Okay, good.
And on a high note, yeah.
Yeah, we can do that.
We can do the tortillas, not the salsa though. So.
Correct.
All right. So I think we'll just move on. So thank you, everyone. We appreciate all of the folks on the line and all of your expertise. And we're going to do a few quick polls. As I mentioned before, this training is sort of part of a series, and we are wrapping up our webinar series today, but we're also going to have a number of either in-person or virtual trainings, kind of depending on how COVID goes, but more in depth. So we're just curious to know like what folks were looking for, what types of trainings they would like to see in the future. So I'll give people a chance to a little bit to fill that out. And some of the options are produce safety rule training. It's kind of more grower focused. And then we have a number of more food handling trainings like food handler certification and basic good manufacturing practices, and then preventative controls, qualified individual training for larger operations. So I'll give folks maybe about 5 more seconds to fill that out. And then we will end the poll. And so it looks like there's kind of a diversity of folks. Definitely the food handler and certificate training courses look popular with this crowd, along with the basic good manufacturing practices. So thank you for sharing those. And we will keep that in consideration as we think of future workshops. And then also, again, because COVID is still here and folks kind of have varying comforts with being in person or doing things virtually. There's kind of pros and cons of both. We just wanted to kind of see like what your preference would be for future trainings. So would you be interested in something in person or more of a virtual live training? With virtual, you can also kind of do the go at your own pace where things are recorded. And then there's a number of hybrid options. So again, we'll give people a little longer to take some time to answer the poll. All right, about a couple more seconds. And then we'll end the poll. And it looks like there's sort of a variety again, but the virtual trainings seem to be what folks are interested in now. And so again, that's super helpful and we appreciate you sharing that, and we'll keep that in mind as we move forward too. So speaking of that, keep your eye out. We will have be announcing upcoming trainings through the CCOF newsletter as well as our project partners. And so kind of starting late fall, winter next year is when we are planning to do those. So keep an eye out. And then if you missed any of the other webinars in this series, or you're just curious about, other organic webinars and training opportunities, the CCOF YouTube channel has all of these recordings listed on it. So just kind of go check those out. And finally, the CCOF Foundation offers grants to organic producers. And right now we have the Brickmont Hardship Assistance Grant that is open through May 26th. So if you know an organic producer who suffered financial loss due to an extreme hardship, send them our way. And it's always great to support the organic community in that way. So thank you again to all of our presenters. It was nice spending an hour and a half talking about cottage foods with you. And thanks to the folks who took a little time out of their morning to join us. And there'll be one more evaluation. I know you just filled out 2 polls, but you have a little more feedback to give. There's an evaluation form for that. And with that, thank you and have a good day.